Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Shelley Oreo. Today we're going to talk about elder abuse, including the different types of abuse, the kinds of cases our office sees, the role of our victim advocate in these cases, and some tips and alerts to help detect and prevent abuse and becoming a victim of some common scams. I'm joined by Assistant Chief Deputy District Attorney Paul Durenberger, Deputy District Attorney Frederick, or Fritz, Gotha, and Bridgid Moffett Yeo. Welcome, everyone.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Joe.
Can you just all introduce yourselves and let us know what your role is within the office? And we'll start with Paul.
I'm Paul Durenberger. I'm the Assistant Chief. I oversee elder abuse, also oversee domestic violence, human trafficking, and juvenile justice.
Okay.
Fritz?
Well, I've been a DA in the office for about 16 years. I'm currently running the elder abuse program. My responsibilities are basically filing all the new cases, which means I review all the new police reports having to do with elder abuse, and I'll file and make charging decisions based on those. I'll also review warrants from the various police agencies to see if there's a probable cause that someone has committed a crime, and we'll do a warrant for their arrest. And once those charges have been brought, I'll be the one responsible for negotiating all the cases and taking them through either prelim or trial and sentencing, if that's appropriate as well.
And so we call that a vertical unit, is that correct?
That's
so
right.
You do everything from intake all the way through the end of the case.
Correct.
Okay. And Bridgid?
Hi, my name is Bridgid Moffett Yeo, and I'm the victim advocate in the Elder Abuse Department, part of the Victim Witness Program.
Okay. Before we get into the elder abuse unit specifically, can you first explain, and this is for any of you, what is elder abuse? What is considered or what would fall underneath that?
Well, there's a statute that covers elder abuse. It's 368B1 of the Penal Code. That basically says anytime an adult that's 65 years or older, or it can also be a disabled person, someone that can't take care of their daily living activities or can't protect their own rights, those are defined as our victims. And then 368 has a number of different categories within it that can have to do with physical abuse or financial abuse, both by caretakers and non-caretakers. So the statute's pretty broad, but those are the victims that are typically the ones that we see.
Can we give a quick example of neglect versus abuse, whether it's a real case or a type of case, and then the financial? Maybe kind of see, people can actually visualize like what would a financial, I don't know if we can. But,
I'll do my best.
Okay.
So a financial case can be any number of things. The statute itself, if we're charging under 368 of the Penal Code, it says it can be fraud, it can be direct theft, it can be identity theft. So you're dealing with check fraud, you're dealing with simply taking money from an elderly person. You might have misrepresentations on some loan documents, falsifying, forgery, things of that nature that could all be financial elder abuse.
whether it's a family member or a stranger who does that.
Either one.
Okay.
And we've seen both.
Okay.
I could say most of the financial crimes I've seen, unless it's a robbery, if you want to put that in the financial category, they're almost all family members doing that. Or a caretaker, someone that's close to the victim. So you're not a lot of times having a stranger identity theft, although you can have it maybe through the mail or something like that. A neglect case, I would just file that at least in my mind, as a type of abuse case. So there's really, if you're talking about elder abuse, in terms of a physical type of elder abuse, neglect is just basically letting them, unfortunately, decay or get to the point where they're not being cared for as they need to be. That can be via malnutrition. That can be not turning them in bed when you're responsible for doing that. And these pressure ulcers can develop, and they are just horrible to look at. They are sores that go all the way to the bone. They're very difficult to treat. And they're also a type of wound that experts have problems dealing with. It's actually an area, I think, both in the medical field and the legal field that needs some more looking at. Because many experts won't sit here and tell you as sometimes we might need in prosecution. That wound has been there for a week. That wound has been there for 2 weeks. They're very hesitant to put a time frame on it. And what that does is it plays into potential defenses. The defense can say, I didn't see that. That may have occurred over just a few days versus what we believe to be a number of weeks indicating serious neglect. So there's an area I think that needs some looking into. And I think that typically on your neglect side cases, those are the types you're dealing with. The ulcers, the malnutrition, and those types of injuries that we see.
Okay.
And also just cleaning up, like if you have a bedridden elder, that person is going to have to go to the bathroom, and that has to be cleaned up. And we've seen cases where that has not been done.
Well, and that's a major indication, right, that the care is subpar. When the law enforcement goes out, or maybe it's APS or whoever it is that sort of discovers the victim in the state they're in, they're covered in feces, they're covered in urine, multiple adult diapers just really placed on top of each other, never cleaned. That is like your standard neglect case, and when you're going to see a lot of the wounds I've talked about as well. So I would consider that to be a physical abuse case.
And then there's obviously the more violent type of physical abuse.
Right, and that's when you're getting into assaultive type conduct.
Okay.
Fists.
Right.
We've seen people get kicked, thrown to the ground, use of weapons. So that's when you get more into your assaultive behaviors, which are going to fall under the 368B of the statute, your physical abuse.
And so for all those cases, are a large majority family versus stranger? You talked about the financial being more family.
I would say, unfortunately, I think it's just the nature of the beast. Who are the elderly folks around the most? It's going to be their family. So I think most of my cases, I unfortunately couldn't give you a percentage, but it's probably much higher than 50% are family members or friends, loved ones that are perpetrating the abuse in some fashion.
That has a close connection or access to that person. Right. Okay. And so let's talk about what we see in our elder abuse unit then. Are there some cases that are more prevalent than others, or do you kind of see all of it?
I'd say it's more of the relationship crimes that we see more often.
Is that family members and friends?
So adult children, grandchildren who are abusing the parent of the house financially, physically. It's very kind of DV type of crime.
Right, I totally agree with that. It's usually family on family crime, where it's a grandparent or an elderly parent. A lot of times there's a connection between financial abuse and physical abuse. Okay. Like the financial piece will be the one that starts the physical abuse. For instance, mom or dad give me money, mom or dad says no, and then as a result of that, there's physical violence. So that's very typically what we see.
And I forgot to mention too, is that I think we see mostly that the adult children typically are suffering from some form of mental health or substance abuse or both. So that's a really huge factor because the family members have a hard time in prosecuting their adult children, because if not, then they will be homeless, or so there's just this really push and pull between that relationship.
So then how are those crimes reported? Who typically would report that if it's not the parents?
Well, it typically is going to be the parent. In the moment when they're in physical danger, they're going to usually notify law enforcement. So that's when you're going to get a 911 call. You're going to get a police response to the residence. And depending on the agency, you might have a body-worn camera that catches a statement. I did also want to say that we have other types of victims. For instance, the unit will handle a number of robbery crimes or burglaries, or really any crime that has to do with a victim that's over 65. Okay. So it's not always just the abuse within the family, but for instance, I'll have like robbery cases with an elderly victim that is within the elder abuse unit.
So stranger crimes.
Stranger crimes, right. So it's not all family on family, but the bulk of it is 80% if I had to like sort of guesstimate a figure.
Those cases sound very complicated just because of the family dynamic. So either Bridgid or Fritz or Paul, can you talk about how that makes these cases challenging, or maybe they're not as challenging? And then Bridgid, I anticipate you take a big role in that part.
And that's really why these cases end up going to Fritz, even the stranger robberies or burglaries, because typically if you're older 65, but especially if you're a dependent adult, you need some extra help, oftentimes getting to court, understanding the court system, dealing with the rigors of having to come in and testify, and having a special advocate like Bridgid makes all the difference. So that's one of the reasons that we funnel these cases into this unit, so that they really do get the extra attention that we want victims that are especially seniors to get in our community.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that because these cases can be so complex, it's really reaching out, being able to explain to them the court process, but also making that connection. So when they are having a difficulty of whether or not they want to testify against a family member, I like to think that we are another buffer in between that, to be able to have that conversation, explain to them that there are other avenues for a resolution, not just jail, that Fritz is always open to, as well as being able to educate them on how these cases don't just resolve in their son or their daughter as a new person, that this could happen over and over again if there is not an intervention.
Paul, are these cases sometimes similar to domestic violence where something happens, they call police, reports filed, but then they don't? They have these feelings where they don't want to then move forward on a case. Is that similar to the family relationship dynamic?
It is. There's a family dynamic, but it's also part of it, in my opinion, is that victims really don't know what is going to be the end result of this process. And they fear the worst. They fear that all that our office wants to do is convict somebody and put them in prison forever. And that really isn't the case. That's another reason why we take cases to this elder abuse unit. We want to have conversations with the victims and their families and talk to them about how safe they are. Is there anything we can do to make them safer? There are times when we take cases and we're able to get the abuser, whether it be a son, a daughter, or a neighbor, whoever it is, maybe the real problem is this person has a serious addiction problem and needs real help with drugs, that we can actually find a program in Sacramento that will incorporate that into their probationary process. So a lot of times by doing these cases, we will initially get victims that are saying, oh, I really don't want to be part of the process. I don't want bad things to happen. But then when we start to talk to them and communicate, they say, this seems fair to me.
Is that kind of what Bridgid was saying about this is going to go on and keep happening unless there's some kind of intervention to where you get some help so that this doesn't continue to happen?
Definitely.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's, we work closely with Adult Protective Services too, and other programs too. And Fritz will ask, what kind of resolution does the family want, so that maybe we can prevent this or minimize it happening again.
That's really kind of hits the nail on the head. In terms of these cases, I mean, they come in different forms. You're going to have someone that's a serial abuser, and we're going to have to treat them with much more seriousness because of the danger they present. But then you might have somebody that does have a drug problem, that maybe has a mental health problem. Maybe we do there's mental health court, there's drug court, there's a number of different rehab programs. These are, depending on the nature of the case, these can be on the table. And if we approach the victim with the idea that we're not just, as Paul was talking about, trying to jail someone, lock them up, throw away the key, what we're trying to do is make sure that the victim is safe and that in the future they don't continue to suffer the abuse. And that's really the core of it. And sometimes that means the defendant needs to get help with whatever their issue is, be that mental, be that drugs or something else.
And then the victims tend to be more cooperative and feel more comfortable
Correct.
than moving forward. I don't know if we have any numbers, but can you give us an idea of how many cases that you see or handle on a regular basis? I mean,
At a given time, I probably have about 60 cases. Now, they're going to be in different stages of activity, right? So you're going to have the intake cases. You're going to have cases that are have been declared incompetent, where the defendant has been found under Penal Code Section 1368 to not be able to assist their attorney, to be suffering from some kind of mental disease or disorder. So their criminal proceedings are suspended. And there's not a lot of active court hearings on those cases. So I'll have a number in that category, but I'll also have prelims, and I'll also have trials that we have to conduct, and sentencings, or other hearings that might pop up on these cases, settlement conferences and so forth. So they're all at different stages at any given time, and they all have vulnerable victims that we try to take care of and make sure that they're part of the process and engaged in the process.
Can you give us an example of one of the more egregious cases and maybe one that we caught early? Give us a range if you can.
Well, the caught early one is a challenge. I mean, most of the cases, if they don't have a significant criminal history, they would fall in that category. So we definitely had cases where a victim and their abuser are living together. There hasn't been any violence, and we catch at least what we're being told is the first instance of violence. And then we've had them either serve jail time if that's appropriate or do a program. And we have had some success stories where they appear to be rehabilitated. And we hope that sticks over time, obviously. We've also had cases involving three strikers. We've had cases involving home invasion robberies with elderly victims. We had a wonderful elderly victim last year, I believe, and the defendant was a multi-striker. The victim was a veteran. He lived in a home, a senior citizen's home. The defendant went in his house, essentially beat him up, was violent, stole items of his, and we were able to catch him very quickly. He was prosecuted, and since he had a number of strikes, he went to prison for life. We've also had cases where the victim has passed away. We recently did a case where the defendant had punched an elderly man at a gas station. That individual passed away and died as a result of the punch. So we prosecuted that case as well. So they run the gamut from very serious violence, even sometimes resulting in death, to three strikes cases resulting in life sentences, to cases where somebody commits an act of violence or theft against their elderly parent, perhaps, and they also are treated, but much less so from the punishment side, much more towards the rehabilitation side, if that's appropriate.
So let's talk a little bit about the current laws, which you mentioned, the penal codes. The current laws that we have to protect elders, do you think they can be changed, adjusted to better address these kinds of crimes? Or what are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is we could have a whole podcast just dedicated to that, because some of the things I could get really into the weeds in terms of the evidence code and what's permitted in, for instance, a domestic violence case, which might not be permitted in the elder abuse case. But just a couple areas of interest that I've noticed having done these kind of cases for about 3 years now. The first one is related to guns. If you, in California, if you commit a assault, a battery against anyone, it doesn't have to be an elder. It could be a misdemeanor. If you commit an act of domestic violence, certainly if you commit any felony, your gun rights are taken away in some capacity. If it's felony for life. And that's true for elder abuse too. If it's a felony, it's going to be a life restriction on guns. But if you get convicted of a misdemeanor elder abuse or a misdemeanor elder battery, your gun rights are still maintained. Whereas if you commit a regular battery against somebody, that your gun rights are taken away for 10 years.
Do you think that's an oversight or why?
Yes. What happened was they passed the gun law and then subsequently passed the elder abuse law. So elder abuse was not listed in the statute and they've never gone back to correct it.
Right. And these are things that we've brought up every year. CDAA, our California District Attorneys Association, they'll put out kind of feelers for, hey, does anybody have an idea about new laws that could be introduced? And I proposed this a couple times. I'm sure other DA's offices have as well. I don't know why there's no movement on it, but it seems to be a pretty common
That's
thing.
Shocking. I mean,
Yes.
To me, that's just, you're excluding that group almost.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have talked about, in fact, we talked about it before this podcast started, was laws that really protect consumers when it comes to these scam phone calls. Right now, there's a scam phone call going on. I got hit 5 times on my county cell phone yesterday, saying that my Social Security number had been suspended and that I had to press 1 to find out how to make my Social Security number unsuspended. And of course, if you press 1 and you say anything, it's going to be recorded. If you use the word yes or no, they have all these tricks where they record your voice. And if you use the word yes, it can be used later when they try to go to something to get into your personal information. So the best advice we always give people is just hang up that phone call. Don't say one word to anyone on the phone call. Don't threaten them. Don't tell them, I know you're a scam or anything like that. It doesn't help. But we really do need laws to protect consumers because elders are especially vulnerable. I don't know what it is about the brain as it gets older. I found this in my father when he was in his 90s. They're just a little too trusting sometimes. I think they came from a generation that was, where people wouldn't do the kinds of scams that they pull now.
Maybe their guard has come down a little bit as they're getting
a little bit, yeah. And so they're more susceptible for these scams. And whether it's the IRS scam, this is the IRS, you have to pay us money, or it's Social Security. We had elderly victims get calls from people saying that your son or daughter or stepson or nephew has been arrested in a foreign country or is in a hospital in a foreign country and you have to send money immediately. And we've had people that have had their life savings cleaned out by doing this. And it's really tragic. And unfortunately, we prosecute very few of those cases because most of these most of the perpetrators are in other countries. I had a discussion with some FBI people that said some of this money actually gets directed to terrorist organizations. So they've been able to do trails on the money. So it's something you want to avoid at all costs. If there's ever anybody on the phone that's offering you anything, just politely say no and hang up.
I think the technology part too might also make elderly people a bit more vulnerable because the recording of the voices, that they wouldn't think about those things because who knew you could do that? Anything else about laws that you?
Well, there's a couple areas that I think could be looked at, and I'm going to make a comparison. We've already talked about sort of the connections between domestic violence or the similarities between domestic violence crimes and elder abuse crimes. But a rule I think should be looked at is a 273.5 penal code violation, which is our typical domestic violence case, is going to be basically causing someone a traumatic condition, and that's someone being a wife or a girlfriend or a mother of child. Basically, all you need for a felony level crime is causing that traumatic condition, which most typically is going to be a bruise of some sort, okay? Now, if it's an elder person, those elements are very different. You could have an elder person with a black eye, with some bruises that you would look at and it would make you cringe. But the requirements in the elder abuse statute basically don't say a traumatic condition. They say that that bruise had to get there, or that condition, it could be a scratch or something, had to get there by means likely to cause great bodily injury or death, which as the DA, as the prosecutor, I consider that to be a much higher burden, a much higher level to get to for a felony crime. And I don't understand why we treat our elderly victims differently, and some could say with less seriousness than our domestic violence victims.
It's so surprising to hear both those things because the elderly probably are going to get injured quicker, faster than someone who's younger, healthy. So, yeah, that's pretty surprising. Join us for our next episode where we'll continue our conversation on elder abuse, focusing on the Elder Death Review Team called EDIRT.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.